Young people have always come through that door uncertain. That's not a criticism. It's just what I've watched. A young person arriving here for the first time, standing slightly apart from the room, taking in who's already in it, trying on a way of holding themselves, a borrowed confidence, a particular kind of quietness, and watching to see how it lands. Looking for a group not just to be with, but to measure themselves against. Underneath whatever they're apparently doing, that hunger is almost always what's actually driving them. None of that is new. Every generation of young people who've come through that door has been doing some version of it. The uncertainty is the same. The hunger is the same. The need to find out, through contact with the world and the people in it, who they're going to be. That's the oldest thing I watch in this room. It's not a problem. It's the work. What I've been watching change is the room they're doing it in. There's a mirror in the other room, the online room, social media, whatever people are calling it in here. Not a real mirror, but the function is the same, or close enough. It shows young people, constantly, from the moment the phone comes out of the pocket, a version of what they could be, should be, what the well-lived version of a life at their age looks like. The body, the face, the bedroom, the group of friends, the relationship, the morning routine, the way confidence sits on a person who has already, apparently, arrived somewhere. The images weren't real before the filter application. They're less real after it. But they arrive with such frequency and such confidence that frequency becomes its own kind of authority. Something seen 1,000 times starts to feel like evidence of something true. I've watched young people come through that door and sit with their phones out, and I can see the mirror working on them in real time. The small recalibration, the look that crosses a face when the image on the screen is held up unconsciously against the one looking at it. The gap between the two isn't neutral. It carries a charge. And the online room is very good at making sure the charge stays live. Because a person measuring themselves against an image is a person who can't quite stop looking. The old version of this happened in halls and rooms like mine. The young person watched the people around them, assembled a picture, measured themselves against it, and then, depending on who they were, conformed to it, or rebelled against it, or found something in between. But the picture the room produced was made of actual people, in actual circumstances, on an actual day, which meant it was imperfect and contradictory and human in all the ways that made it, finally, livable. The mirror the other room holds up has none of those imperfections. It was curated before it arrived, and it never stops arriving. There's a thing I've watched young people do in this room for as long as I can remember. They'd arrive not quite knowing anyone, and there'd be a period, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes painfully so, of being on the outside of something, of watching a group that already had its rhythms, its shorthand, its way of moving around each other. And the young person would have to find their way in. Not quickly, not without cost. Through the ordinary friction of showing up and being uncertain and saying the wrong thing occasionally and coming back anyway. That process was never comfortable. I'm not describing it as though it was, but it was doing something. The belonging that came out the other end of it was built from actual contact. The group knew the young person because they'd been in the room with them when things went wrong. The young person knew the group because they'd had to read actual faces in actual time and adjust and try again. What came out of all that friction was real, in a way that required the friction to be real. The other online room offers belonging without the friction. A group available immediately. People who share the interest, the identity, the aesthetic, the politics. Waiting on the screen before the young person has had to sit in a single uncomfortable silence to find them. The group is real in its way. The connection is real in its way. But it was never built from the thing that makes the real room version solid. The experience of being in the same space as someone when it's difficult. And then staying anyway. What that means, and I watch this in the young people who come through that door, is that some of the skills that only develop through that friction aren't developing at the same rate they used to. Reading a face that isn't performing for a camera. Sitting with silence that isn't comfortable. Repairing something that went wrong in the room in real time without the option of simply not responding. I watched a group of young people here last year. Friends, you could see that immediately in the way they moved around each other. And they were fine when they were talking. But in the gaps, the ordinary silences that rooms produce, the moment between one thing and the next, almost all of them reached for their phones before the silence had lasted 2 seconds. Not to do anything specific, just to fill the gap before it could be anything. And I thought, they've never learned to sit in a room together and be quiet. Not because they're incapable of it, because every room they've shared has had a gap filler built into it. The silence was never allowed to just be silence. Which is the thing I keep coming back to, the held moment. There's a quality of attention that's different from the one that scans. Scanning is useful. It's what you do when you're taking in a room, reading what's needed, staying oriented. The held moment is something else. It's what happens when the scanning stops and something gets your full attention. Not because you decided to give it, but because the thing itself earned it. A face doing something unexpected. A conversation that turned a corner and became something neither person planned. A piece of music coming through that door from somewhere else in the building, arriving at exactly the wrong moment to ignore. Something said in this room that landed before the person saying it had finished understanding what they'd said. The held moment can't be summoned. You can't decide to have one. It requires 2 things, something worth holding and enough stillness to let it land. The online room was built, this is what it was built to do, whatever else it also does, to make sure neither of those things lasts long. Something worth holding requires your attention to stay still long enough for depth to arrive. And stillness, in an environment engineered to fill every gap before it can be anything, is the one thing that's genuinely hard to come by. I watch young people in this room and I know when a held moment is happening, because I've watched them for a very long time. The face changes. The scanning stops. Something settles. It's unmistakable and it's become rarer. Not because young people can't have them, because the digital realm they spend the most time in was built for a different kind of attention entirely. Faster, shallower, always moving. And the kind of attention you spend the most time practicing is the kind you get better at. The other kind goes the other way. Wonder. Wonder is a held moment that opened. That's the best I can do with it. The thing you stayed with long enough that it became something more than it first appeared to be. Larger or stranger or more moving or more interesting than you'd have predicted if someone had described it to you before you'd experienced it. It requires the staying, the moment that didn't get interrupted or filled or replaced by the next thing before it had finished being the current thing. I've watched wonder arrive in this room many times. It doesn't announce itself, it just takes hold of someone very quietly and does something to their face. And the young people I've watched it happen to, in this room, in the real room, in a silence that was allowed to last long enough, come back from it different in some small way, slightly more themselves than they were before, as though something had been confirmed that they didn't know needed confirming. That's not available in a room that's engineered to fill the silence, the gap, before it can be anything. It's not that the other room is too loud exactly. It's that it's too fast. And wonder has never moved at that speed. There was a girl who started coming here a few months ago. 13, maybe 14. She'd arrived slightly ahead of the others. I don't know whether that was nerves or strategy, and position herself near enough to the group to be available to it without quite committing to being in it. Watching the dynamic, working out the unwritten order of things. It took weeks. There were nights where she said almost nothing and left earlier than she'd planned. A night where something she said landed wrong and she carried it home on her face. But she kept coming back. And the group, without discussing it, without making anything of it, gradually made room. The way rooms do when nobody's performing the making room. I watched her face one evening when the conversation turned somewhere unexpected, and she said the thing she actually thought, rather than the thing she'd calculated was safe to say. And the room received it. Nothing dramatic. Someone agreed. Someone pushed back lightly. She stayed in it. The scanning had stopped, just for that moment. Something had landed. It took months, and it was uncomfortable in stretches, but I watched it from this wall, and it was real. The young people who come through that door are the same as they've always been. Uncertain, hungry, trying things on, performing and scanning for responses. And what I watch in the ones who spend time in this room, real time, with the phone in their pocket, is that the friction does its work. Not quickly, not without cost, but the face that couldn't quite sit in a silence eventually learns to. The belonging that took months to build turns out to hold in a way the faster kind doesn't. My hall can't compete with that digital space on its own terms. It was never built for speed or volume or the particular pull of something engineered to keep you in it. What it has is what it's always had. Actual people, imperfect and in real time. Silences that are allowed to last. The friction that's uncomfortable and necessary, and, in the end, the only thing that makes belonging solid. I'll still be here when you get back.